The city cafe hummed with its usual late afternoon energy, a vibrant tapestry of clinking cups, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Angela Parker sat at a small table on the bustling patio, soaking in the golden warmth of the sun. Her cappuccino, its foam swirled perfectly, sat untouched before her, reflecting the fading light. She scrolled through emails on her phone, her attention split between the screen and the lively pulse of the street. The world felt alive, safe, ordinary. She didn't notice the three men at first. Their low, coarse laughter blended into the cafe's ambient noise. Just another thread in the urban symphony. Only when their voices sharpened, drawing closer, did Angela glance up. Three figures sauntered down the sidewalk, their steps deliberate despite their casual air. The leader, tall and wiry, moved with a predator's grace, his smirk as cutting as his roaming eyes. Behind him trailed a blond man with a jagged scar slicing across his jaw, and a stocky figure shrouded in a hoodie, both chuckling at some shared joke. Angela's gaze flicked back to her phone. Nothing to worry about, she told herself. The patio was crowded families, couples, friends, and all lost in their own worlds. She wasn't alone. But the scrape of chairs against concrete jolted her attention. The three men had stopped, claiming the empty seats around her table without invitation. The tall one's grin widened as he looked her over. Then at the chairs. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said, his voice light, almost friendly. Angela nodded faintly, her lips pressed into a thin, polite smile. She stayed silent, hoping they'd move on. They didn't. "Mind if we sit?" the leader asked, already pulling out a chair. The blonde one laughed, his voice sharp. "Man, don't ask her. She doesn't care." The words hit harder than they should have, a subtle jab that made Angela's skin prickle. She glanced toward the cafe, searching for a waiter, anyone who might notice the shift in the air. No one did. "Relax," the tall one said, settling into the chair like he owned it. "We're just being friendly, right, guys?" Angela forced another smile, her gut twisting with unease. "Stay calm," she thought. "Don't escalate. We'll just hang out for a bit," the blonde added, his tone dripping with mockery. "You don't mind, do you?" Angela's pulse quickened. She gripped her coffee cup tighter, saying nothing. The leader, Greg, leaned back, his smirk unwavering as his eyes roamed over her belongings, her phone, her purse, like he was sizing up a prize. "You don't look like you belong around here," he said, his voice casual but edged with malice. "What brings you to this side of town?" Angela hesitated, her mind racing for a safe response. She glanced toward the cafe door again, willing someone to intervene. Still, no one noticed. "Just here for coffee," she said finally, keeping her voice steady. Greg's smirk grew. "Coffee, huh? That's a fancy bag for just a coffee run." The blonde, Ryan, leaned forward, elbows on the table, pointing at her purse. "Bet she's got all kinds of goodies in there." "Huh." Angela's hand instinctively moved to her bag, pulling it closer. "It's just a purse," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "Relax," Ryan said, chuckling as he leaned back. "We're just curious. No need to get jumpy." The third man, Paul, snickered, his voice low and grating. "She's acting like we're gonna rob her or something." The word rob sent a chill down Angela's spine. She scanned the patio again, but the other patrons were oblivious, absorbed in their own lives. Greg leaned forward, his smirk hardening into something colder. "You seem nervous, Angela." Her name on his lips made her flinch. She hadn't told him her name, but they'd overheard it when she ordered her coffee. "I'm not nervous," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Greg chuckled, his friends joining in. "Sure you're not." Ryan reached across the table, tapping her untouched coffee cup. Still hasn't touched her drink. "What's the matter?" "Not thirsty." Angela pushed the cup away, her unease swelling into dread. Greg's gaze narrowed. "So, what's in the bag?" "Nothing important," Angela said, clutching her purse tighter. "That's for me to decide," Greg replied, his tone deceptively casual as he reached for it. Angela jerked it back. "Don't touch my things," she said, her voice rising, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables. Greg's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, leaning back. "Feisty," he said, his voice thick with mock admiration. "I like that." Paul's laugh was harsh, cutting through the air. "She's got some fight in her. Maybe we should stick around." Angela's heart pounded, her palms slick with sweat. She refused to back down. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Leave you alone? We're just getting started." He nodded to Ryan, who stood and stepped closer, blocking her path to the cafe door. Paul moved behind her chair, boxing her in. Angela's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Greg rose slowly, towering over her as he snatched her purse from her lap. "Stop!" Angela cried, grabbing for it. But Greg yanked it away with ease. "Calm down," he said, laughing as he unzipped the bag. "We're just taking a look." Angela stood, her chair scraping loudly against the concrete. "Give it back." Ryan shoved her shoulder, forcing her back a step. "Sit down, sweetheart. You're making a scene." Her voice caught in her throat as she looked around. The other patrons seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Greg rifled through her purse, pulling out her wallet. "Ooh, look at this," he said, tossing it to Ryan. Ryan caught it, flipping it open with a grin. "Looks like somebody's doing all right for herself." Tears stung Angela's eyes as anger and humiliation churned inside her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but fear held her back. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Take the money and leave." Greg smirked, tossing her purse to Paul, who rummaged through it with a satisfied grunt. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll be on our way soon enough." He reached for the bracelet on her wrist, and Angela instinctively pulled back. Now, Greg said, his tone turning icy. "Don't make me ask twice." Her hand shook as she unclasped the bracelet and handed it over. Greg pocketed it with a smug grin. "Good girl." He motioned to his friends, and the three began to walk away, their laughter echoing like a taunt. Angela sank into her chair, her body trembling with a mix of fear, anger, and shame. The patio resumed its usual rhythm, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But for Angela, everything had shifted. Her hands rested on the table, still shaking, as the men's laughter lingered in her ears. Greg tossed her bracelet up and caught it like a trophy, their figures retreating down the sidewalk. Angela, a familiar voice cut through her daze. She turned to see her father, James Parker, striding toward her from the cafe entrance. His presence was commanding, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Relief flooded Angela, though it was quickly overtaken by shame. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James's gaze swept over her, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he took in her pale face and trembling hands. "What happened?" Angela's eyes dropped to the table. "They took my purse, my bracelet." James's jaw tightened, his gaze snapping to the retreating gang, their laughter still audible over the street's bustle. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "Dad, don't," Angela began, but he was already moving. James crossed the patio in long, deliberate strides, his posture radiating authority. The gang was turning the corner when his deep voice sliced through the air. "Hey!" The three men stopped, their laughter fading as they turned to face him. Greg's smirk returned, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. "Well, look at this," Greg said, his tone mocking. "The cavalry's here." James stopped a few feet away, his stance calm but unyielding. "Give back what you took." Greg raised an eyebrow, glancing at his friends. "Took? We didn't take anything, old man." "Don't lie to me," James said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "My daughter told me everything." "Hand it over." Ryan snickered. "Looks like Daddy's here to save the day." Paul crossed his arms, grinning. "What are you gonna do?" "Grandpa, call those cops." James's gaze didn't waver. "You've got one chance to do the right thing. Give it back and walk away. Greg stepped forward, his smirk widening, or what James didn't move, but his presence seemed to fill the space. You don't want to find out. For a moment, silence hung heavy, the tension crackling like static. A few onlookers had noticed the confrontation, their murmurs adding to the charged atmosphere. Greg chuckled, shaking his head. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But see, we're not. James moved faster than anyone expected. In a blur, he closed the distance, disarming Greg's smugness with a precise, controlled strike to his wrist. The bracelet fell to the ground. Greg staggered back, shock replacing his smirk. Ryan lunged forward, but James sidestepped, using the man's momentum to send him stumbling into Paul. The wallet and purse hit the pavement as the trio scrambled to regain their footing. Pick it up, James said, his voice calm but commanding. Greg, clutching his wrist, glared but complied, tossing the items at James's feet. You are gonna regret this, he spat. James didn't flinch. Walk away. Now. The three men exchanged glances, their bravado crumbling under James's unyielding stare. Muttering curses, they backed off, disappearing into the crowd. James gathered Angela's belongings and returned to the patio, where she sat, tears streaming down her face. He knelt beside her, his voice soft but steady. You're safe now. Angela nodded, her trembling hands reaching for his. The cafe's buzz resumed, but for Angela and James, the moment was a quiet victory, a father's love standing firm against the case of the world. The air crackled with tension as the young man sneered, his voice dripping with defiance. We don't take orders from anyone, he spat, flicking a dismissive gesture toward his buddies, especially not some washed-up old geezer. With a cocky tilt of his head, he signaled for his crew to follow, already turning to strut away. But James wasn't about to let them slip off that easily. His voice sliced through the warm afternoon like a razor. Cowards. The single word landed like a thunderclap, stopping the group dead in their tracks. Greg, the ringleader, pivoted slowly, his smug grin replaced by a steely glare that could have burned holes through steel. What did you just say, he growled, his tone low and dangerous. James stood his ground, his calm demeanor unshaken. You heard me, he said, his voice steady as a rock. You think you're tough, ganging up on a woman sitting by herself, stealing her things. That's not tough, that's pathetic. Ryan, one of Greg's lackeys, faltered, his bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. But Greg wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, fists clenched, so tight his knuckles whitened. You've got a big mouth for someone who's all alone, he hissed, his eyes narrowing as he sized James up. James didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Greg's. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd faced worse odds and walked away unscathed. Greg let out a hollow laugh, though it sounded more like a nervous bark. Big talk, old man. You think you're some kind of hero? I'm no hero, James said, his tone unwavering. I'm a father, Maeshtam, and I don't let scum like you hurt my family and walk away. Paul, the third member of the trio, muttered something under his breath, but Greg silenced him with a sharp gesture, his eyes never leaving James. The air between them was thick with unspoken threats, and Greg's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a delicate bracelet, Angela's bracelet dangling it tauntingly in the sunlight. You want this back so bad? Come and take it. James's eyes narrowed, but he didn't budge. This is your last chance, he said, his voice low and final. Drop it and walk away. Greg's grin widened as he tossed the bracelet into the air and caught it with a flourish. Make me? The standoff had drawn a crowd now, the murmurs of onlookers growing louder as they watched the drama unfold on the sunlit patio. Angela, still seated at her table, gripped its edge so tightly her fingers ached. Her father's calm, coiled posture was a stark contrast to the electric tension in the air. She knew what he was capable of. Years of Navy SEAL training had forged him into something unstoppable, But she also knew he didn't want this to spiral out of control. Greg took another step forward, his sneer practically daring James to make a move. "Well, I'm waiting." The silence stretched taut, every second feeling like an eternity. James stood like a statue, his eyes locked on Greg, who continued to toss the bracelet from hand to hand with a mocking smirk. The whispers from the crowd grew louder, but no one dared step in. Angela's heart pounded in her chest, her father's unyielding resolve both awe-inspiring and terrifying. She couldn't stay out of it any longer. Forcing her trembling legs to move, she stood and hurried toward them, her voice shaking but resolute. "Dad, stop," she called, stepping between her father and Greg. She pressed her hands against James's chest, trying to push him back. "It's not worth it. Let them go." James's gaze softened as he looked down at her, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. "Angela, they stole from you," he said, his voice tight. "They humiliated you." "I know," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "But this isn't the way. Please." Her eyes pleaded with him, and for a moment, James wavered. He let out a slow, heavy breath, his fists unclenching as he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "All right," he said softly, "let's go." Relief flooded through Angela as she stepped back, guiding her father away from the confrontation. But just as they turned, Greg's voice cut through the air like a venomous dart. "Yeah, that's right. Walk away," he jeered, his tone dripping with malice. "Just like the cowards you people always are." The words hit like a slap. Angela froze, her blood turning to ice. James stopped mid-step, his shoulders stiffening as a deep sigh escaped him. Greg, emboldened by their retreat, chuckled darkly. "What, too scared to stand up for your little girl figures?" Angela's grip on her father's arm tightened, her voice a desperate whisper. "Dad, don't—" But James was already turning back, his expression calm, yet laced with a quiet resignation, as if he'd hoped to avoid this but knew deep down it was inevitable. "You just couldn't keep your mouth shut." "Could you?" he said, his tone dangerously even. Greg spread his arms in a mocking shrug. "What, just calling it like I see it?" James took a step forward, his voice low and deliberate. "I gave you every chance to walk away. Now you're going to regret not taking it." Greg's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Big talk, old man. Let's see if you can back it up." In an instant, the tension shattered. James moved like lightning, his fist connecting with Greg's jaw before the punk could even blink. Greg stumbled back, stunned, as the crowd gasped. Ryan, reacting on instinct, lunged at James from the side, but James sidestepped with effortless precision, grabbing Ryan's arm and twisting it behind his back. Ryan yelped in pain as James shoved him toward Paul, who barely caught his flailing friend. Greg recovered quickly, his face twisted with fury. He charged at James, swinging wildly, but James ducked under the blow and delivered a sharp punch to Greg's gut. The air rushed out of Greg in a pained gasp as he doubled over. "Stop him!" Greg barked, his voice hoarse with desperation. Paul hesitated, clearly rattled, but then threw a clumsy punch. James caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it hard enough to make Paul drop to one knee with a yelp. Angela watched, her heart in her throat, torn between awe and terror. Her father was outnumbered, but he moved with a controlled ferocity that left no doubt who was in charge. Greg, now livid, pulled a small knife from his pocket, its blade glinting menacingly in the sunlight. "Dad," Angela screamed, her voice piercing the chaos. James's eyes flicked to the knife, his body tensing. Greg lunged, but James sidestepped. Grabbing Greg's wrist and slamming it against the edge of a nearby table, the knife clattered to the ground. Useless. Ryan, back on his feet, charged with a shout. "You're dead!" "Old man," he roared. James turned just in time, grabbing Ryan by the shirt and hurling him into Paul, who had also risen. The two stumbled, barely staying upright. Greg, clutching his side, barked at his friends. "Take him down." The fight escalated. Ryan and Paul trying to flank James while Greg threw wild punches that barely grazed their target. James ducked and countered with a swift kick to Greg's knee, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Angela's pulse raced as the chaos unfolded, tables tipping over and chairs scattering in the fray. Despite their numbers, the gang was no match for her father's skill. Greg struggled to his feet, his face a mask of rage. "You're gonna pay for this," he spat, lunging again. James sidestepped and landed a precise blow to Greg's ribs, sending him crashing into a table. Paul and Ryan hesitated, their confidence crumbling, but pride drove them to press on. The crowd gasped as the brawl raged, the clatter of overturned furniture punctuating the violence. James remained a calm center in the storm, his movements sharp and deliberate, but the gang grew more desperate, their attacks wilder with each failed attempt to bring him down. Greg, nursing his ribs, gestured for his friends to regroup. "Surround him," he shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. Ryan and Paul spread out, trying to box James in. James stood firm, his eyes darting between them, reading their every move. Ryan swung first, a sloppy punch aimed at James's head. James ducked, pivoting smoothly and wrenching Ryan to the ground with a twist of his arm. Paul rushed in, throwing a heavy blow, but James deflected it with his forearm and countered with a brutal elbow to Paul's jaw, sending him staggering into a toppled table. Greg, circling like a predator, spotted a broken chair leg amidst the debris. Angela's stomach lurched as she saw him grab it. "Dad, behind you," she yelled. James turned just in time, raising his arm to block the swinging wood. The chair leg splintered against his forearm, the impact stinging but not slowing him. With a swift motion, James yanked the weapon from Greg's hands, snapped it over his knee, and tossed the pieces aside. The fight was chaos now, a whirlwind of fists and fury. James moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, his every strike calculated, his every dodge instinctive. The gang, battered and humiliated, fought on with stubborn defiance, but it was clear they were out of their depth. The patio was a wreck, tables overturned, chairs scattered, and the crowd watched in stunned silence as one man stood unshaken against three. Angela's heart pounded as she watched her father, a mix of pride and fear swirling within her. She knew he could end this whenever he chose, but she also knew he was holding back, giving them one last chance to walk away. But Greg and his crew were too far gone, their pride and anger blinding them to the reality of who they were up against. And as the brawl raged on, it was clear that James wasn't just fighting for Angela's bracelet, he was fighting for something deeper, something no one could take from him. Under the dim glow of the cafe patio string lights, the air crackled with tension. Greg's voice cut through the night, sharp and final, like a blade slicing through the chatter. "You're done," he sneered, his tone icy enough to make the crowd hush. Greg took a cautious step back, his earlier swagger fading into a flicker of doubt. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. James stood motionless, his silence more chilling than any retort, his piercing gaze locked onto Greg, unraveling the bully's bravado. Paul and Ryan, Greg's lackeys, swapped uneasy glances, their confidence eroding as James took a deliberate step forward. "You've got two choices," James said, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "Walk away now, or keep pushing and regret it." Greg's lips curled into a sneer, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "We're not scared of you," he shot back, but the quiver in his words betrayed him. Ryan shifted, his boots scuffing the pavement. "Maybe we should just go." "Greg," he muttered, dabbing at the blood trickling from his lip. "Shut up," Greg snapped, his glare slicing toward Ryan. James took another step, his presence looming. "Make your choice," he said, eyes boring into Greg's. The crowd around the patio had swelled, their murmurs forming a cage of attention. Greg's sneer wavered as he scanned the faces, his escape routes shrinking, his options dwindling. But pride burned hotter than fear. With a frustrated yell, he lunged at James, a final act of defiance. James moved like water, sidestepping Greg's wild charge with effortless precision. A swift kick to Greg's leg sent him sprawling onto the pavement, the thud echoing in the still night. Ryan and Paul hesitated, then rushed in together, desperation fueling their attack. James was ready. He grabbed Ryan by his shirt, driving a knee into his midsection. Ryan collapsed, gasping for air. Paul swung wildly, but James deflected the blow, landing a quick jab to Paul's temple. Paul stumbled, dazed, and within moments, all three lay groaning on the ground, clutching their bruises. The patio fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of the defeated trio. James stood over them, his breathing even, his expression a mix of calm and command. "You had your chance," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. He glanced at Angela, who stood nearby, her legs trembling. "You okay?" Angela nodded, her voice shaky. "I'm fine," she managed, though her eyes darted to Greg, still sprawled on the ground. He glared up at James, his face twisted with hatred. "You think this is over," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "You're gonna pay for this." James didn't flinch. "We'll see," he replied, his tone unshaken. The distant wail of sirens pierced the tension, and the crowd stirred, whispers rippling through. "Cops are coming." Someone muttered. Greg's glare shifted to panic. Ryan and Paul exchanged nervous looks, the weight of their actions sinking in. James turned to Angela, his voice softening. "Stay close to me." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as the sirens grew louder. Greg and his crew scrambled to their feet, their faces a mix of defiance and fear. "We need to get out of here," Ryan hissed, his eyes darting toward the crowd. Paul nodded, wiping blood from his split lip. "Let's go." "Greg, this isn't worth it." Greg hesitated, his pride warring with the pain radiating from his ribs. "You think this is over?" he growled at James, his voice dripping with venom. "I'll remember this." Ryan tugged at his arm. With a final hateful glare, Greg spat at the ground near James's feet and turned to flee, his crew shoving through the crowd in a frantic bid to escape. James's hand steadied Angela. "Stay here," he said firmly. Her eyes widened. "Dad, don't," but James cut her off, his voice resolute. "They're not getting away with this." Angela's heart pounded, but she knew better than to argue. "Be careful," she whispered. James gave her a nod before jogging after the fleeing trio. The chase tore through the city streets, Greg leading the way with frantic determination, weaving through pedestrians and dodging traffic. "They're not going to catch us," he panted, glancing back. Ryan, trailing behind, cursed under his breath. "He's still coming." James pursued at a steady pace, his movements disciplined, efficient. Years of training had honed his instincts. He didn't rush, didn't waste energy. He knew the moment would come. Greg veered into a narrow alley, gesturing for his crew to follow. The walls were lined with dumpsters and shadows, a perfect hideout or so they thought. "Here," Greg hissed, ducking behind a stack of crates. "We'll lose him here." Ryan and Paul collapsed against the wall, their breaths ragged. "You sure?" Paul asked, his voice trembling. "What if he finds us?" Greg sneered. "He won't. The old man's probably winded." But their confidence shattered as James appeared at the alley's mouth, his silhouette stark against the fading sunlight. He walked forward, his gaze unrelenting. "You picked the wrong alley," he said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Ryan and Paul froze, their bravado crumbling. Greg stepped forward, masking fear with bravado. "You think you're some tough guy," he snarled. "You should have let us go." James stopped a few feet away, his posture calm but ready. "And let you hurt someone else." He shook his head. "Not a chance." Greg's lip curled. "You're outnumbered, old man. You really want to do this again?" James's eyes flicked to Ryan and Paul, both visibly hesitant. "Looks like your backup's not so eager this time," he said, his tone sharp. "Shut up," Greg barked, desperation creeping into his voice. He nodded at his crew. "Get him." Ryan and Paul charged, their movements sloppy. James sidestepped with Ryan's swing, landing a precise strike to his ribs that sent him sprawling. Paul lunged, but James blocked and countered with a sharp elbow to his head. leaving him dazed. Greg watched, his confidence unraveling. "This is your last chance," James said, his voice low and dangerous. "Surrender now, or it gets worse." Greg's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "Screw you!" he spat, rushing at James with all his strength. James dodged effortlessly, countering with a punch to Greg's gut and a sweeping kick that sent him crashing to the ground. Ryan and Paul groaned, making no move to rise. Greg struggled to his knees, blood trickling from his mouth, his glare burning. "You don't know who you're messing with," he wheezed. James crouched down, his gaze cold. "I know exactly who you are," he said. "A coward who preys on the weak. That ends now." Greg's face twisted. But before he could retort, sirens blared closer, flashing lights illuminating the alley. Officers poured in, their footsteps pounding. "There they are," James said, motioning to the gang. "They've got stolen property and a long list of crimes to answer for." Greg, Ryan, and Paul glared as the police closed in, the red and blue lights casting harsh shadows. James stood tall, his presence commanding. "Stay down," he ordered, his eyes sharp for any sign of resistance. Ryan groaned, clutching his ribs. Paul leaned against the wall, his breath ragged. But Greg, defiant to the end, pushed himself to his knees, wiping blood from his mouth. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible. James's gaze snapped to him, catching the subtle shift in Greg's posture, the coil of muscles ready to bolt. "Don't even think about it," James warned, his voice like steel. But Greg did. With a sudden burst, he lunged past James, shoving with all his weight and darting toward the alley's other exit. "Stop him!" James barked, turning to pursue. Ryan and Paul, emboldened, scrambled up. Paul shoved a dumpster toward James, forcing him to sidestep. Ryan charged, clumsy but determined. James reacted instinctively, his Navy SEAL training kicking in. He sidestepped Ryan's charge, using his momentum to slam him into the wall. Ryan crumpled, but the scuffle gave Greg a head start. James sprinted after Greg, the chase spilling back onto the city streets. Greg's desperation drove him, but James's resolve was unbreakable. The sirens grew deafening, the police closing in. Greg's fate was sealed, but James wouldn't stop until justice was served. The chase had already taken James deep into the alley, his steps quick and frantic, cutting through the shadows cast by the towering brick walls. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the raw adrenaline of pursuit. "Get back here," he bellowed, his voice ricocheting off the grimy surfaces, sharp and commanding. Paul, one of Greg's lackeys, made a desperate move to block him, lunging forward with wild eyes. James didn't hesitate. With a single, precise strike to Paul's chest, he sent the man crashing to the pavement, coughing and gasping as the air fled his lungs. By the time James navigated the clutter of overturned crates and debris, Greg, the wiry, cunning leader of the group, had vanished around a corner, swallowed by the labyrinth of the city's underbelly. The wail of sirens grew closer, and soon police officers stormed into the alley, their voices booming with authority. "Stay down," they barked at Paul and Ryan, another of Greg's men who was still reeling from the chaos. One officer, a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor, turned to James. "You okay, sir?" James nodded, his breathing steady but his jaw clenched tight, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "I'm fine," he said, his voice clipped, but their leader got away. The officer's eyes flicked toward the alley's exit, where Greg had slipped into the night. "We'll set up a perimeter." "Can you describe him?" James's expression hardened, his mind conjuring Greg's image with vivid clarity. Mid-30s, wiry build, brown hair, dangerous, desperate. The officer nodded, relaying the description into his radio with brisk efficiency. Meanwhile, Ryan and Paul, now handcuffed and slumped against the cold ground, exchanged uneasy glances. The fight had stripped them of their bravado, leaving only the dawning reality of their predicament. James turned to them, his presence looming like a storm cloud. His voice dropped to a low, menacing growl. "You'd better hope the police find Greg before I do." Ryan's face paled, and he averted his gaze, unable to meet James's piercing stare. Paul muttered something defiant under his breath, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his crumbling resolve. At that moment, Angela appeared at the mouth of the alley, her eyes wide with worry. "Dad," she called, her voice cutting through the tension. James's rigid posture softened slightly as he turned to her. "I'm fine," he said quickly, his tone reassuring but firm. Angela's gaze darted to the cuffed men, then to the shadowed corner where Greg had fled. "Where's the other one?" she asked, her voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. James's jaw tightened again. He ran. Angela hesitated, her emotions warring on her face. "What now?" James glanced at the officers hauling Ryan and Paul to their feet. "Now we start tracking him down. He's not getting far." Angela's expression wavered, uncertainty creeping in. "You're going after him." James placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "Not alone. The police are involved now, but I'm not letting this go. Not after what they did." She nodded slowly, her trust in her father unwavering despite the fear lingering in her eyes. The officer from earlier approached again, his tone professional but urgent. "We'll take these two in for questioning. If you have any additional information, it'll help us locate their leader." James's gaze shifted to Ryan and Paul, his voice cold and certain. "Don't worry, they'll talk." The officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning to assist his colleagues as they loaded the two men into a squad car. As the alley began to clear, Angela touched her father's arm, her voice soft but heavy with a concern. "What if they don't catch him?" James's expression turned steely, his voice quiet but resolute. "Then I will." Angela didn't respond, but the unwavering determination in his tone eased her fears. If only for the moment, Greg may have slipped away. But James knew one truth with absolute certainty: the hunt was far from over. Hours later, the police station buzzed with a quiet, purposeful energy. James and Angela stood in a dimly lit observation room, separated from the interrogation chamber by a thick pane of reinforced glass. Inside, Ryan and Paul sat slumped in metal chairs, their wrists cuffed to the table. Their faces were bruised, their postures sullen, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. A stern officer stood nearby, arms crossed, his sharp eyes studying the two men with unrelenting scrutiny. Angela stared through the glass, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "What if they don't talk?" she asked, her voice taut with frustration and anger. "They will," James said evenly, his gaze never leaving the men in the other room. "They're cowards, and cowards break when they realize they're alone." A detective entered the observation room, his notepad in hand and a weary air about him. He nodded at James. "We've started questioning them, and they're not saying much yet, just playing tough. You know how it is." James folded his arms, his expression unyielding. "Let me in there." The detective frowned, clearly hesitant. "Sir, I understand you've got personal stakes here, but this isn't a vigilante flick. We've got procedures. Let us handle it." James's voice dropped, firm and uncompromising. "Your procedures won't work on them. They need to see the man who took them down. They need to know I'm not bluffing. I'll get what you need." The detective hesitated, glancing at Angela, then back to James. "You push too hard. We lose what little cooperation we've got." "I won't push too hard," James said, though his tone carried a weight that left no room for doubt. "I'll get them to talk. You'll get your leads." After a long pause, the detective sighed and gestured toward the door. "Fine, but keep it clean. I'm watching." James nodded and strode toward the interrogation room. The door creaked faintly as he stepped inside, his presence instantly shifting the room's atmosphere. Ryan's head snapped up, his jaw tightening as he recognized James. Paul, already on edge, seemed to shrink further into his chair. "You," Ryan muttered, his voice dripping with resentment. James closed the door deliberately, taking his time as he approached the table. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood tall, his icy gaze flicking between the two men. "Me," he said flatly, his voice carrying an authority that made the small room feel claustrophobic. Paul shifted nervously, his cuffed hands clinking against the metal table. We already told the cops everything, he said, his voice trembling. We don't know where Greg went. James tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto Paul's. Do I look like I believe you? Paul swallowed hard, glancing at Ryan for support. Ryan sneered, leaning back in his chair. What do you want from us? We're not snitches. James leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the table. The sharp motion made both men flinch. You're not snitches. You're cowards. Cowards who ran when things got tough and left your leader to fend for himself. How do you think Greg feels about that? Ryan's face darkened. Shut up. You don't know anything. Oh, I know plenty, James shot back, his voice rising with controlled intensity. I know Greg ditched you the second he had a chance. I know you two are sitting here, about to take the fall for everything he's done. So tell me, what's your plan? Protect him. Go to prison for him. Paul's gaze dropped to the table, his shoulders slumping. Don't even start, James snapped, cutting him off. He stood straight, pacing slowly around the table, his presence commanding. You know exactly where Greg would go. He didn't just disappear. He's got a hideout, a plan someone like him always does. And you're going to tell me where. Paul's breathing quickened, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. Ryan, however, clenched his fists and glared at James. We're not scared of you, he spat. James stopped pacing, turning to face Ryan directly. You're not scared. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. You should be. You've already seen what I can do. And if you think the cops are going to protect you when Greg finds out you cracked, you're dead wrong. Ryan flinched, but quickly masked it with a sneer. You think you're so tough, don't you? James didn't blink. I know. He straightened, his gaze flicking back to Paul. Last chance. Talk. Paul's voice cracked as he finally broke. There's a warehouse, he blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. East side of town. He's used it before when things got messy. Ryan whipped his head toward Paul, his expression a mix of shock and fury. What the hell are you doing? I'm not going down for him, Ryan Paul shot back, his voice desperate. James's expression remained impassive, but his presence seemed to grow even more imposing. What else? Paul hesitated, then added, There's a bar by the docks. He used to work there. It's quiet. Out of the way. He could be there. Ryan slammed his fists on the table. You're a coward. Paul, you're going to get us both killed. James leaned closer to Ryan, his voice ice cold. You were already dead the moment you picked the wrong side. Ryan glared at him but said nothing, his jaw tight with barely concealed rage. James stepped back, turning toward the door. Enjoy your time here. You're going to have plenty of it. As the door closed behind him, Paul slumped in his chair, visibly shaken. Ryan sat rigid, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. James stepped out of the interrogation room, his shoulders set with the tension of unfinished business. Angela was waiting in the observation room, her eyes scanning his face anxiously. Did they say anything? She asked quickly. James nodded, his voice measured but firm. A warehouse on the east side, a bar near the docks. It's a start. Angela exhaled, some of the tension leaving her body, but her relief was fleeting as James's expression darkened. They were holding back, he continued, his voice lowering. There's more they're not saying. Greg wouldn't hold up alone, he's too cocky. If he's got others with him, we're walking into a trap. The detective from earlier walked into the observation room, his notepad in hand. He looked at James with a mix of respect and apprehension. We've got units ready to check the warehouse and the bar. What do you want to do? James didn't hesitate. Before we make a move, I'm going back in. We need to know if Greg's got backup and how many people he's working with. The detective raised an eyebrow. You already got them to crack once. You really think they'll give up more? They will, James said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Angela touched his arm, her voice soft but urgent. Dad, are you sure they're already riled up? What if they dig their heels in? They won't, James replied, phone, his eyes steady. Greg left them behind, and they know it. It's only a matter of time before they turn on him completely. I just need to push a little harder. The detective sighed, motioning toward the interrogation room. All right, but don't cross the line. James nodded, his resolve unshaken. As he turned back toward the interrogation room, one thing was clear. Greg's escape had only delayed the inevitable. James wasn't just hunting a fugitive, he was chasing justice, and he wouldn't stop until it was done. The door to the interrogation room shut with a heavy thud, sealing James inside with a palpable shift in the air. Ryan and Paul, seated at the table, glanced up, their earlier bravado replaced by a nervous edge. Ryan slouched deeper into his chair, muttering, "What's this now?" James didn't answer right away. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, and leaned over the table, palms pressed against its icy surface. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, as he let the weight of his presence settle over them. Paul's knee jittered under the table, betraying his unease, while Ryan, though still scowling, couldn't quite mask the discomfort in his eyes. "Here's the deal," James finally said, his voice low but edged with unyielding authority. "You gave me locations, warehouses, bars. That's a start. But we both know Greg doesn't pull jobs alone. So, who's he working with?" Paul's knee froze mid-bounce, his eyes flicking to Ryan, who let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Why do you care?" Ryan spat, his tone dripping with defiance. "You think you're some kind of hero, taking down Greg's whole crew?" James didn't flinch, his gaze bore into Ryan, steady and unrelenting. "I care because the next person Greg goes after might not be as lucky as my daughter was. You think this ends with you sitting here, Greg's already planning his next move? If we don't stop him, someone else gets hurt or worse." His words landed like a punch, and Paul shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twisting together. "I told you everything," Paul said, his voice thin and unsteady. "The warehouse, the bar, that's all I know." James turned his piercing stare to Paul, his expression cutting through the younger man's flimsy defense. "You're holding back. You've seen who Greg runs with. You've heard names. Tell me, Paul, or this gets worse for you." Ryan snorted, leaning back with a smirk. "You're wasting your time. Greg doesn't share his plans. He doesn't trust anyone." James straightened, his voice rising just enough to carry a sharp edge. "Oh, he trusts someone. He's not reckless enough to work without a safety net. You want to sit here and cover for him, fine. But when Greg feels the heat, he'll sell you out faster than you can blink. He won't lose a second's sleep over it." Paul's breathing quickened, his resolve visibly crumbling under the pressure. There's one guy," Paul stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Paul, shut up!" Ryan barked, slamming his fists on the table, the chains on his cuffs rattling. "No, I'm done," Paul snapped back, his voice cracking with desperation. "You saw how Greg bolted. He left us to rot. You think he gives a damn about us?" He turned to James, and his eyes wide with fear. "It's Eddie. Greg trusts him with the big stuff, moving stolen goods, finding safe houses. If Greg's got a plan, Eddie's in on it." James nodded slowly, and his face unreadable. "Where do I find Eddie?" Paul stared at his cuffed hands, hesitating before mumbling, "I don't know exactly. He's around the docks sometimes. Drives a black truck, always moving, never stays still for long." James shifted his gaze to Ryan, who was glaring at Paul with barely contained rage. "Anything to add?" Ryan's jaw clenched so tightly it seemed it might crack, but he said nothing. "Didn't think so," James said, stepping back. "You can sit here and stew, but Greg's already cut you loose. You're the ones who'll pay for his mess." Paul slumped in his chair, defeated, while Ryan's glare burned into the table. James turned and left, the door slamming shut behind him. Outside, Angela looked up, her face a mix of hope and worry. What did they say? "Greg's got a guy named Eddie," James said, his tone grim. "If we find Eddie, we find Greg." Night had draped the city in a heavy cloak, casting long, jagged shadows across the docks. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and diesel, the silence broken only by the distant hum of a truck or the creak of a crane swaying in the breeze. James stood near the water's edge, his eyes scanning the maze of warehouses and shipping containers. Angela had stayed back at the station, reluctantly agreeing to let him handle this alone. He knew she wanted to be here, but this was no place for her. This required the kind of precision and instinct he'd honed over years. Paul's tip about Eddie was a thin thread, but it was enough. A black truck, always on the move, haunting the docks. Someone like Eddie, with connections as deep as Paul described, wouldn't stay hidden for long if you knew where to look. James approached a group of dock workers huddled near a stack of crates, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the dark. They eyed him warily as he neared, their conversation dying out. "Hey," James said, his voice calm but carrying weight. "I'm looking for Eddie. Black truck. Seen him around." The tallest of the group, a wiry man with a weathered face, stepped forward, sizing James up. "Who's asking?" "Someone who needs to find him," James replied, his tone leaving no room for games. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You're in the wrong place, old man. Keep moving." James's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. "I'm not asking for permission. Is Eddie here or not?" The man's smirk wavered, his confidence shaken by James's intensity. He glanced at his companions, who shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't know who you think you are." James cut him off, stepping closer, his presence looming. "Let me make this clear. You tell me where Eddie is, or I'll find him myself. But if I have to do it my way, you won't like what happens next." The man hesitated, his bravado crumbling. Finally, he sighed, jerking his thumb toward a dimly lit corner of the docks lined with shipping containers. "Saw him over there, maybe an hour ago. Don't know if he's still around." James gave a curt nod. "Thanks." The area near the containers was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint rustle of wind and the occasional clang of metal. James moved with purpose, his eyes sweeping the shadows for any sign of movement. Then he spotted it, a black truck parked at the far end of the row, its engine idling softly. He approached cautiously, his footsteps silent against the gravel. As he got closer, he saw a tall, wiry figure leaning against the truck, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's face was half hidden in the shadows. "Eddie!" James called out, his voice slicing through the stillness. The man froze, his head snapping up. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his hand instinctively reaching for something inside his jacket. James stopped a few feet away, his stance relaxed but ready. "I'm here about Greg." Eddie's eyes narrowed, and he let out a harsh laugh. "Greg, what did he do now?" "You know exactly what he did," James said, his voice flat. "He's in deep, and you're about to go down with him if you don't start talking. Where is he?" Eddie tossed his cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his boot. "You think I'm just gonna spill? Get lost." James took a step closer, his tone dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Greg doesn't give a damn about you. The second things go bad, he'll leave you holding the bag, just like he did with Ryan and Paul. You want to take the fall for him?" Eddie's bravado flickered, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. James pressed harder. "I've got 2 of Greg's guys in custody. They're talking. They gave me your name. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Eddie cursed under his breath, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered, leaning back against the truck. "Greg's got a spot, an old warehouse deeper in the docks. It's off the grid, abandoned. He uses it when he needs to lie low." "How many people are with him?" James asked, his gaze unwavering. 2, maybe 3, Eddie said, his voice tinged with resentment. "Hired muscle. Greg doesn't trust them much, but they're there to watch his back." "Where exactly is it?" James pressed. Eddie rattled off an address, his tone bitter. "That's all you're getting." James nodded, his expression cold. "Smart move. Eddie, stay out of this. You don't want to be around when we come for Greg." Eddie glared but said nothing, his silence a grudging surrender. James turned and headed back to the station. The address burned into his memory. At the station, James relayed the information to the lead detective, who wasted no time assembling a team to raid the warehouse. Angela listened, her face a mix of relief and dread. "You found him?" she asked. "We've got a location," James confirmed, his voice steady but resolute. "But this isn't over." The detective clapped James on the shoulder. "Good work. We'll hit the warehouse tonight." James's jaw tightened. "I'm coming with you." "Dad," Angela started, but James silenced her with a look. "This ends tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Under the cover of night, the team gathered outside the abandoned warehouse, the air thick with tension. The building loomed like a forgotten relic, its rusted walls and broken windows bathed in pale moonlight. It looked deserted, but James knew better. Greg was inside, likely biding his time, waiting for the storm to pass. The detective stood beside him, gesturing to the tactical team nearby. "We go in quiet. Breach from two sides. Sweep the place. Secure it." James nodded, his eyes locked on the warehouse. "What if Greg fights back?" The detective adjusted his vest. "We'll handle it. You're here to observe." "Got it." James didn't reply, but the set of his jaw made it clear he wouldn't stand by if things went south. Angela was back at the station, safe but frustrated, and James was grateful for that. This was his fight now, driven by years of experience and a father's need to protect. As the team moved into position, James stayed close to the lead officer, his senses sharp, scanning every shadow. The warehouse was unnervingly silent, the only sounds the faint groans of its rusted frame. Then, with a sudden crash, the breaching team smashed through the front door, flashlights cutting through the darkness as officers flooded inside, their shouts echoing in the cavernous space. The shadows clung to every corner of the abandoned warehouse as the lead officer's voice cut through the tense silence, low and commanding. "Clear the left," he barked, urgency sharpening his words. James trailed close behind, his movements sharp and calculated, his eyes scanning the wreckage of the interior. The place was a graveyard of neglect, piles of rubble, splintered crates, and rusted machinery sprawled across the floor, each shadow a potential threat. The team moved with precision, sweeping room by room, their boots scuffing against the gritty concrete. James anchored the rear, his senses dialed to a razor's edge, every creak and groan of the building setting his nerves alight. They reached a cramped hallway, its walls stained with years of grime, when a faint scuffle echoed from the far end. The lead officer's fist shot up, freezing the team in place. "Hold," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Weapons snapped to attention, barrels trained down the dim corridor. The shuffling grew louder, closer, until two figures exploded into view, their shouts raw and vicious. Each gripped a metal pipe, their eyes wild with desperation. "Contact," the lead officer roared. The first attacker swung his pipe in a frantic arc, the metal smashing into the wall as an officer sidestepped with practiced ease. The second charged straight for James, his weapon raised high, a snarl twisting his face. James didn't hesitate. He pivoted smoothly, seizing the man's wrist in a vice-like grip and twisting hard. The pipe clattered to the floor, and with a precise strike to the man's ribs, James sent him sprawling in a heap. The first attacker lunged at another officer, but a swift baton strike to his side dropped him to his knees, gasping and clutching his chest. The team swarmed, securing the man with swift efficiency. James turned back to the man he'd floored, yanking him up by the collar. "Where's Greg?" he demanded, his voice a low, icy growl. The man glared back, blood trickling from a split lip, his defiance burning through the pain. "Go to hell," he spat. James's grip tightened, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Wrong answer. Try again." The man's resolve wavered under the weight of James's unyielding stare. "Upstairs," he finally muttered, his voice cracking. "Top floor. That's all I know." James shoved him back, signaling the officers to cuff both men. "Let's move," he said, his tone steady but laced with urgency. The team pressed deeper into the warehouse, the air growing thicker, heavier with each step. The faint sound of movement echoed again, a warning of more trouble lurking ahead. As they rounded a corner, Three new figures emerged from the gloom, weapons raised. A burly man with a shaved head led the charge, swinging a heavy chain with brutal force. James ducked low, the chain whistling past his head, and grabbed the man's arm, using his momentum to slam him into a nearby wall. The chain hit the ground with a dull clang, and a quick strike to the man's chest left him wheezing, crumpled against the concrete. The other two hesitated, their confidence shaken by James's ruthless efficiency. One bolted, but an officer tackled him before he could vanish into the shadows. The last man stood his ground, a knife glinting in his hand, his sneer daring James to act. "You're making a mistake," James said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Drop it." The man lunged, his blade slashing through the air. James sidestepped, seizing the man's wrist and twisting until the knife fell. A swift kick to the back of the knee sent him to the floor, where officers quickly restrained him. James straightened, his breathing even despite the chaos. "How many more?" he asked the nearest officer. "Unknown," came the tight reply. James's gaze lifted to the top floor, where faint light bled through the cracks in the walls. Greg was up there, he could feel it. A predator lying in wait. "Let's finish this," James said, his tone brooking no argument. The warehouse fell eerily quiet, the only sound a distant hum of forgotten machinery. The team moved in tight formation, their boots echoing in the stillness as they approached the staircase. James's eyes stayed locked on the steps ahead, each one pulling him closer to the endgame. The lower floors were clear, but the top remained a dark unknown. Greg was cunning, ruthless, a man who thrived on control. James knew this wouldn't be clean. It never was with men like him. At the base of the stairs, James raised a hand, halting the team. His instincts screamed, the silence too heavy, too charged. He gestured for the officers to fan out, forming a tight perimeter around the narrow staircase. "Stay sharp," he muttered. "We don't know what's waiting up there." The lead officer nodded, and they began their ascent, the creaking steps amplifying the tension. The air grew thick, the anticipation almost suffocating. The top floor was a maze of shadows, lit only by slivers of light from broken windows. Dust coated the floor, and debris littered the space, clear signs of long abandonment. But as the team advanced, the faint sound of footsteps broke the silence, slithering from the darkness. James's pulse quickened. Greg was close, watching, waiting. "Move in," James commanded, his voice low and firm. The officers spread out, their eyes scanning the stacks of crates and scattered furniture. Then, a flicker of movement caught James's eye, a figure slipping between two towering stacks of crates. Instinct took over. James moved toward the shadow, his body low, senses razor sharp. Greg emerged, a crowbar clutched in his hand, his eyes blazing with feral rage. His lips twisted into a sneer as he swung the weapon at James. "You should have stayed out of this," Greg snarled, his voice hoarse with fury. "You're as pathetic as the rest of them." James didn't flinch. He blocked the crowbar with his forearm, the impact jarring his bones. Greg swung again, faster, but James was already moving, sidestepping and landing a heavy punch to Greg's midsection. Greg staggered, gasping, but his fury fueled a wild counterattack. His fist flew, but James ducked under it, seizing Greg's arm and twisting it behind his back. With a forceful shove, he slammed Greg into the wall, the thud echoing in the quiet. "You're done, Greg," James said, his voice cold as ice. "This ends now." Greg writhed, desperate to break free, but James's grip was unrelenting. The officers closed in, but Greg wasn't finished. With a sudden burst of strength, he kicked off the wall, throwing himself backward and knocking James off balance. The two men hit the floor, rolling in a tangle of limbs. Greg scrambled on top, his teeth bared, raising the crowbars for a crushing blow. "You're not getting away with it," he roared. James reacted instantly, raising his arm to block the strike. The crowbar connected with a sharp crack, pain shooting through his arm. But James didn't falter. He shoved Greg off, using his momentum to pin him to the ground with a knee to the chest. Greg thrashed, his eyes burning with defiance. "You think you've won? You're weak, just like them." James leaned in, his voice a low, chilling whisper. I'm not like you, Greg. I don't hurt people to feel strong. Greg's bitter laugh rasped in the air. You're wrong. You're just like me. You can't stop me. You don't even know who I am. James tightened his grip on Greg's collar, pulling him up to meet his gaze. I know exactly who you are. A coward who preys on others to feel powerful. And that ends tonight. Greg's eyes flicked to the officers, but instead of fighting, he smirked, his voice dripping with venom. You're right, it's over. But this isn't the last you'll hear from me. James held his gaze, unflinching. We'll see about that. With a final twist, he forced Greg to the floor, holding him until the officers swarmed in, cuffing him tightly. As Greg was dragged to his feet, he shot James a final glare. You'll regret this, he hissed. I'll make sure of it. James stood tall, watching as Greg was led away. The hunt was over, but a nagging unease lingered. There was more to the secrets Greg had buried deep. Get him to the car, James ordered the officers. I want a full sweep of this place. No one leaves until we know everything. The detective nearby gave a grim nod. We'll handle it. James turned toward the exit, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a fleeting moment of relief. Greg's reign of terror was finished, his victim safe from his grasp. But as he stepped into the cool night air, the warehouse looming behind him, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Greg's final words echoed in his mind, a promise of something darker still to come. The detective's face was a mask of grim satisfaction as he examined the pile of evidence James had uncovered. We've been waiting for a break like this, he said, his voice low and resolute. This stash stolen goods, meticulously cataloged ties directly to the string of robberies plaguing the city. It's the nail in his coffin. James barely acknowledged the detective's words. His focus was elsewhere, his boots scuffing against the dusty warehouse floor as he continued his search. His foot nudged something hard and metallic, a faint clank echoing in the cavernous space. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the edge of a rusted metal panel embedded in the concrete. With a grunt, he pried it loose, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside, tucked away like buried secrets, were several worn notebooks. Their pages were crammed with handwritten lists, names, addresses, dollar amounts, and cryptic notes. James's pulse quickened as he lifted one, flipping through the brittle pages. Ledgers, he said, holding it up for the detective to see. The detective's eyes widened, a spark of realization igniting. This is massive, he muttered, snatching the notebook to scan its contents. Buyers, accomplices, maybe even clients. Greg's going to have a hell of a time talking his way out of this one. Outside, the night air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the warehouse. Greg sat handcuffed in the back of a squad car, his face twisted with rage. His eyes locked onto James as he emerged from the building, a sneer curling his lips. You think you've won, Parker Gregg bellowed, his voice muffled through the glass. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've got people, powerful people. You'll see. James approached the car, his steps deliberate, his expression unshaken. He leaned in close, his voice calm but edged with steel. You've got nothing. Greg, your so-called people scattered the moment you fell. Everything you've built is crumbling, and it's all catching up to you now. Greg's sneer wavered, but he forced a bitter laugh. You a hero, you're just a washed-up soldier playing detective. This changes nothing. James's gaze didn't falter. I don't need to be a hero to stop someone like you, he said quietly. Greg's eyes burned with defiance, but there was a flicker of doubt as the officer in the front seat started the engine. The squad car pulled away, its red and blue lights slicing through the darkness until they faded into the distance. The detective approached, still clutching one of the ledgers. He flipped through its pages, his expression a mix of awe and determination. This is enough to tear his entire operation apart. He said, it's not just robberies, human trafficking, arms deals, money laundering, it's all here. This is a gold mine. James's jaw tightened, his voice hard. Make sure every name in that book pays for what they've done. The detective nodded. We'll assemble a task force. This could take months, years. Even, but you've given us a hell of a starting point. Moments later, Angela arrived, her face a mix of relief and anxiety as she spotted her father near the warehouse entrance. She rushed to him, throwing her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're okay." James hugged her back, his usual stoicism softening just a fraction. "I'm fine," he said gently. "It's over." Angela pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "Is it really? What about everything else Greg was tangled up in?" James glanced at the detective, who held up the ledger like a trophy. "We've got the evidence," the detective said. "We'll follow every lead." Angela nodded, but worry still creased her brow. "And the people he hurt? What about them?" James's expression hardened. "We'll do what we can, starting with getting back what he stole." Over the next few hours, the team worked tirelessly, cataloging the stolen goods and cross-referencing them with open cases. One by one, victims were contacted, their lost possessions recovered and prepared for return. Each call felt like a small triumph, a step toward undoing the chaos Greg had wrought. As dawn broke, James stood outside the warehouse, watching the first rays of sunlight spill over the city. Angela joined him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to him, and he accepted it with a quiet nod. The city was waking up, its hum of life a stark contrast to the night's tension. For a moment, James allowed himself to breathe. Greg's reign of terror was over, and though the road ahead was long, this victory was worth savoring. The next few days were a blur of activity at the police station. Greg's ledgers became the cornerstone of a sprawling investigation. Officers and detectives worked around the clock, cross-referencing names, transactions, and locations with unsolved crimes and known associates. Each revelation painted a darker picture of Greg's criminal empire, a web of robbery, trafficking, illegal arms deals, and money laundering that stretched across the city and beyond. James sat in a conference room with the lead detective, a city map spread across the table, colored pins marked warehouses, stash houses, and meeting points tied to Greg's operations. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," the detective said, shaking his head. "He wasn't just a thief. He had his hands in everything." James leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "What about his crew, Ryan, Paul, Eddie? What are they saying?" The detective's lips curled into a grim smile. Ryan and Paul cracked almost immediately. They're terrified and throwing Greg under the bus to save their own skins. Eddie's holding out, but he's starting to waver. They're all angling for deals, but the DA's not feeling generous. James's jaw tightened. "Don't let them walk. They knew exactly what they were doing." "They won't," the detective assured him. "We've got enough to lock them up for years, even without Greg's testimony." James's gaze drifted to the files scattered across the table, photos of stolen goods, lists of victims, and detailed accounts of the gang's crimes. Each piece of evidence was a step closer to justice, but the sheer scale of Greg's operation was overwhelming. That afternoon, James found himself outside the courthouse. The air was cool, and the buzz of reporters and onlookers filled the space as Ryan and Paul were escorted from a police van. Their heads were bowed, their once cocky demeanors replaced by sullen resignation. Angela stood beside James, her arms crossed. "They don't look so tough now," she said quietly. "They never were," James replied, his tone even. "They just thought they'd never get caught." Angela glanced up at him, her brow furrowed. "Do you think they regret it?" James's eyes stayed fixed on the courthouse doors. "People like them don't regret the pain they cause. They regret losing." Angela fell silent, then asked, "What about Greg?" James's expression darkened. "Greg's worse. He only regrets losing control." Inside the courthouse, the trial began in earnest. The prosecution laid out its case with ruthless precision, presenting a detailed breakdown of Greg's crimes. Photos of stolen goods recovered from the warehouse flashed across screens, alongside pages from the ledgers James had found. The prosecutor's voice was calm but commanding as she addressed the jury. This man built an empire on the suffering of others. She said, he preyed on the vulnerable, using fear and manipulation to maintain his grip on power. But today, the evidence proves that his time is up. Ryan and Paul took the stand first, their faces pale and drawn. Under the prosecutor's questioning, they recounted their roles in Greg's operation, their voices shaky. Greg always had a plan. Ryan said, shifting uncomfortably. He told us who to target, what to do. If anyone stepped out of line, he made sure they paid. Paul nodded, his hands trembling as he gripped the witness stand. We thought it was just robberies at first, but it got worse: trafficking, weapons. It was all Greg. He called every shot. James watched Greg from across the room. The gang leader sat rigid at the defense table, his face a mask of cold defiance. But James noticed the tension in his clenched jaw, the way his fingers gripped the arms of his chair. When the defense took its turn, Greg's lawyer tried to discredit Ryan and Paul, arguing they were exaggerating to save themselves. But the mountain of evidence, ledgers, stolen goods, witness testimony was impossible to dismiss. As the day drew to a close, the prosecutor delivered her closing argument. She turned to the jury, her voice steady and resolute. This case isn't just about one man's crimes, she said. It's about the countless lives he's shattered, families torn apart, communities gripped by fear. Greg Daniels and his accomplices believed they were untouchable. Today, you have the power to prove them wrong. James felt a quiet surge of vindication. This wasn't just about him or Angela. It was about every person Greg had victimized, every life he'd upended. The judge adjourned the trial for the day, announcing that sentencing would follow after deliberation. As the courtroom cleared, James's gaze lingered on Greg, who was escorted out by officers. He's cracking, Angela said, noting Greg's stiff posture. He's lost everything that mattered to him, James replied. Control, power, that's all he ever cared about. Angela nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think he knows it's over? James's lips pressed into a thin line. He knows. The next morning, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The jury had deliberated late into the night, and now they were ready to deliver their verdict. James sat near the back with Angela, his presence steady but alert. He'd seen plenty in his life battlefields. Chaos, loss, but this was different. This was justice unfolding, deliberate and unyielding. Greg sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The smirk he'd worn early in the trial was gone, replaced by a rigid, hollow expression. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something, but Greg didn't respond. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. All rise. The judge entered, her robe sweeping behind her as she took her seat. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the moment that would bring Greg's empire crashing down for good. The courtroom hummed with tension as the judge, her face carved with stern resolve, surveyed the room. You may be seated, she commanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. As everyone settled, she leaned forward, her eyes sharp and unyielding. This court has meticulously examined the evidence and listened to days of testimony. The crimes orchestrated by the defendant, Greg Daniels, and his accomplices have scarred this community deeply. It is our solemn duty to ensure justice is not just a word, but a reality. The prosecutor rose, her posture unwavering, her voice steady as steel. Your Honor, the state demands the maximum sentence for Greg Daniels. His role as the mastermind behind organized theft, human trafficking, and weapons smuggling, coupled with his utter lack of remorse, leaves no room for leniency. These aren't isolated acts. They're a tapestry of calculated cruelty. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the gallery where victims sat, their faces etched with pain and hope. These people deserve peace, closure, and the assurance that this man will face the full consequences of his actions. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable, then shifted her gaze to the defense attorney. Does the defense have anything to add before sentencing? Greg's lawyer stood, his voice calm but deliberate. Your Honor, while we respect the jury's verdict, we urge the court to consider my client's challenging upbringing and the systemic failures that shaped his path. A life sentence without parole is disproportionate. We ask for a measure of compassion. Beside Angela, James felt her tense, her breath catching. He rested a steady hand on her arm, but his jaw tightened as he listened. He had every chance to stop. James muttered under his breath, his voice low but laced with disgust. He didn't because he only cared about himself. Angela gave a faint nod. Her eyes locked on Greg, who sat expressionless at the defense table. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench, silencing the soft ripples of conversation in the gallery. She leaned forward, her voice resonant with authority. This court acknowledges that systemic issues exist. But let us be clear, Greg Daniels made deliberate choices to exploit and harm others for his own gain. This isn't a story of a single misstep or a fleeting lapse in judgment. This is a legacy of intentional, calculated destruction. Her gaze settled on Greg, piercing and unrelenting. You had opportunities to walk away, Mr. Daniels. Instead, you constructed an empire built on the suffering of others, enriching yourself while shattering lives. Now you will face the consequences. She paused, drawing a deep breath, her next words ringing through the courtroom like a bell. Greg Daniels, this court sentences you to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 30 years. A collective murmur swept through the room. Some gasped in relief, others nodded in quiet approval. The judge then turned her attention to Greg's accomplices, Ryan Thomas and Paul Harris, who had cooperated with the prosecution. Her tone remained firm, unyielding. Your assistance to law enforcement has been noted, but it does not absolve you of your roles in these heinous acts. You were not passive bystanders. You were active participants in carrying out Daniel's plans. Her eyes narrowed. This court sentences each of you to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 7. Use this time to reflect on the lives you've damaged. James watched as Ryan and Paul were led away, their heads bowed, their steps heavy. He felt no pity. They had chosen their paths, just as Greg had. As the courtroom began to empty, Angela turned to him, her voice soft but steady. It's done, isn't it, Ed? For now, James replied, his tone measured. Angela's brow furrowed. What do you mean? He nodded toward the prosecution team, still gathering their files. Those ledgers they found, they're filled with names people Greg worked with, people who profited from his crimes. This is just the beginning. Angela's expression grew thoughtful. And the victims, the ones who lost everything because of him, we'll do what we can, James said. The stolen goods we recovered are being returned, but some losses can't be undone. We keep fighting for them, though. That's what matters. Later that evening, James and Angela stepped into the police station one final time. The detective greeted them at the front desk, his face weary but satisfied. Greg's not going anywhere for a long time, he said, handing James a file. We've got teams chasing the leads in those ledgers. With any luck, we'll dismantle the rest of his network before they can regroup. James flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names and connections. Good. Don't let a single one slip through. The detective gave a faint smile. You can count on it, Parker. We couldn't have done this without you. As James and Angela left the station, the cool night air wrapped around them, the city quiet under the soft glow of streetlights. Angela glanced up at her father. Do you think it's really over? James paused, his gaze distant. It's never completely over. But for now, we've done what we could. That's enough. Angela's lips curved into a faint smile, and she slipped her hand into his. Together, they walked into the night, ready for whatever lay ahead. Back at home, the house was steeped in a heavy, almost sacred silence, the kind that follows days of relentless tension. Angela sat curled on the couch, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, the steam curling upward in delicate wisps. The living room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting long, soft shadows across the walls. James stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Neither spoke for a long time, the weight of the trial and its aftermath hanging between them, unspoken but ever present. Finally, Angela's voice broke the stillness, soft and tentative. It feels strange, doesn't it, knowing it's over, at least for now. James turned from this window, his face shadowed but his eyes steady. He crossed the room and sank into the armchair across from her, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. Strange isn't the word I'd choose, he said, his voice low and tinged with exhaustion. Necessary, maybe, but not strange. Angela studied him, searching his face for something she couldn't quite name. You've done this before, haven't you? Things like this. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. In a way, back in the military, it was different, cleaner. In a sense, orders, objectives, a clear enemy. This, he gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the chaos of the past weeks. This was messy. Angela set her mug on the coffee table, her fingers lingering on the handle. Do you think they'll ever understand what they did, Greg, Ryan, Paul, any of them? James leaned back, letting out a slow, heavy breath. Some might. Ryan and Paul, maybe. They're not monsters, just cowards who followed Greg because it was easier than standing on their own. But Greg, he shook his head, his voice hardening. Greg doesn't have it in him to reflect. To him, this was all a game he lost. He'll sit in that cell plotting revenge, not regretting the lives he destroyed. Angela frowned, picking at the edge of her sleeve. It's so unfair. He gets to keep living, even in prison, while everyone he hurt is left to rebuild from nothing. James met her eyes, his expression softening. It is unfair, but that's why we do what we do, return what we can. Dismantle his network, hold the line. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Angela tucked her legs under her, her voice quieter now. Do you think about them, the victims we never met, the ones who didn't even know they were in his crosshairs? Every day, James admitted, his tone raw. People like Greg thrive because they think no one will stop them. That's why it matters to stand in their way. Angela's lips curved into a small, wistful smile, her eyes glistening. You sound like a superhero, you know. James chuckled, the sound low and warm. Hardly. Just someone who refuses to look away. They fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of their words settling into something softer, more manageable. Angela spoke again, her voice steady. What happens now? James rubbed his hands together, the motion slow and deliberate. Now we wait. The police have the ledgers, and they'll track down the rest of Greg's network. We help where we can. That's all there is. And yes, Angela asked, her gaze searching. What are you going to do? A faint smile tugged at his lips. I'm going to sit here, finish this tea you made me, and try to remember what it feels like to breathe without the world on my shoulders. Angela laughed softly, the sound easing the tension in the room. That's a good plan. James's expression grew serious. And you? How are you holding up? She hesitated, then nodded. I'm okay. I think it's just a lot. Knowing how close I came to. She stopped, her voice catching. James reached over, resting a hand on her arm. You're safe now. That's what matters. I know, she said. Steadier now, but it doesn't feel like enough. I want to do more, to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers with quiet pride. Then you will. You've got the most important thing already, the will to make a difference. The rest will come. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its rhythm blending with the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Outside, the world felt distant, peaceful, as if the chaos of the past weeks had been a fleeting nightmare. Angela cradled her mug again, her voice thoughtful. Do you think they'll really shut down the rest of his network? They will, James said firmly. It'll take time, but the police know what they're doing. Greg's empire is crumbling, and there's no one left to hold it together. Angela nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. Good. James leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Good. As the night deepened, their conversation faded into a warm, comfortable quiet. The fight was over for now, but they both knew there would always be more battles to face, and that was okay. They would face them together, step by step, ready for whatever the future held.